Welcome to the Philly Film Room podcast. Along with Eric Sidewater, I'm Nick Waters, and it is week 2 in the NFL. And you know what week 2 means? It is the week for the dogs. And when I say that, I mean a week for the underdogs. If you look at underdogs in week 2, historically, when their underdogs is 6 points or less, they cover at a 65% clip. Why is that the reason? Why is underdog betting such a big factor in week 2 of the NFL? And it's because of overreactions. Every single year, we overreact to our one game sample size from week 1 and we extrapolate it through the rest of the season. So, what are our overreactions to week 1 this year for the Eagles? Zach Bond had a great game, but are we overlooking some factors that might lead to some downfalls of the defense? What about when we look at Bryce Huff? He had 0 pressures in week 1, and now everyone's worried, and rightfully so. But look back to Hassan Reddick when he joined the team. First game, he played with the Eagles, 0 pressures. Second game with the Eagles, 2 pressures. And they weren't even quarterback hits or sacks. It was just 2 of the most basic pressures. So in his first 52 pass rushes with the Eagles, he had 2 pressures. That's a 3.8% clip. So don't forget that when we look back to week 1 and see one guy had a great game or one guy had a down game and extrapolate it out for the rest of the year. And remember that when we go through and we look at the other teams that we're facing. Just because they ran a ton of zone coverage in week 1, that doesn't mean they're going to run the same plays against this offense this week, right? So keep that in mind. But having said that, the Eagles came out of week 1 with a victory, and Eric wasn't with us on our review podcast. So Eric, I want to kick it over to you. What were your thoughts on the Eagles' big win over the Packers?
Yeah, and for those who tuned into the preview pod, I mean, I feel like we kind of hit it right on the nose. My prediction was 31-27 in a sloppy shootout. I mean, that's pretty much what happened. Um, so, yeah, I mean, nothing really surprised me. Obviously, it's good to get out of there with a win. I feel like I jinxed the game because if you remember, I mentioned maybe there's a bad field and all of our analysis doesn't matter. So I'm going to say maybe Lincoln Financial is a good field this time, just so we have the good luck on our side. In terms of how they actually played, if you go back to our quarterback review pod, we talked about how Hurts would make overly aggressive throws when the team was leading, and that came to fruition on that fourth quarter throw. So, it's a little discouraging because you're like, okay, this is one area of potential growth, but it happened so early on. It's going to give them opportunity to really harp on that in practice, just understand game management. I'd rather it happen now, obviously, than later in the season. And these interceptions were so egregious that he's almost forced to try to change up how he's attacking the game. So we'll see how that kind of materializes throughout the season. On defense, at the time we recorded the preview, we didn't know there'd be no White. We didn't know there'd be no Rodgers, even more important in my opinion. I'm speculating that the reason they ran a lot of spot drop zone is because they didn't have Rodgers in there and they just wanted to kind of simplify the assignments at times. That could be completely wrong. It could have been week 1 we're doing that because it's a game plan specific things, because LaFleur is amazing at exploiting match coverage. There's a million explanations. But by all accounts, Rodgers will be back in week 2. This will slide Quinyon to the slot. So I'm very interested to see how their coverage distribution changes in week 2. But yeah, overall, I was happy because I think the Packers are a solid team. You saw a clear improvement on defense, in my opinion, especially in the speed and physicality department. And that's stuff that you can hang your hat on. Coverage busts, as you mentioned, will happen, especially new coordinator, a bunch of new players, even guys getting thrown in at the last second, and you're going against a great offense. So that's to be expected. And hopefully it's something that we just build on throughout the season and you progressively get better, as opposed to last season. It just fell off a cliff after week 11. And I expected I expect us to keep climbing on defense. So I'm just the whole maturation process of the team growing with those coordinators is something that I'm definitely fascinated to watch unfold.
Yeah, well, that's week one. It's time to move on. The past is the past. So we're gonna jump into our preview of the Falcons. So looking at the Falcons real quick from 2023, they were 7-10 and earned the eighth overall pick. They gutted their entire coaching staff and brought in Raheem Morris as the head coach. Zach Robinson is their offensive coordinator. Both of those guys are in their roles for the first time. They also signed or traded for older vets, notably Kirk Cousins at quarterback, and also Justin Simmons and Matt Judon on defense. And that really signals that they're going all in this year. So having said all that, Eric, what did you see when looking at this Falcons offense? What did you notice in their scheme?
Well, when they first brought in Kirk Cousins and knowing like Zach Robinson's pedigree, everyone assumed, oh, they're going to be running a ton of under center play action. And I actually think they will. But they ran literally 0 snaps of that in the first game. And it seems like it's all pointing to Kirk Cousins is not healthy. He has little mobility at all. And he didn't have much before the Achilles blew up. So this guy, he's pretty much a complete statue. So I can only speculate that this is why they shrunk the playbook down so much. I can't imagine that that's going to change overnight. So I think we're going to see, they're probably going to try to throw in a few more, like, I think they're going to be a little bit more dynamic on offense because they saw how brutal it was, not even testing that. It's forcing their hand, but he can only do what he can do. And what I saw repeatedly is they didn't want anything to do with TJ Watt. He completely destroyed the game for them. So they would run like wide zone to the left side over and over and over again, often out of pistol formation. They had some success doing that. And by all accounts, their line is a talented line. Now, the Steelers destroyed their line in week 1. I don't expect that to continue. I think the Steelers' defense might be one of the best in the NFL. We'll definitely see how that materializes over the season. So they ran a lot of that. They ran a lot of little flat plays, throwing to Bijan, a couple screens in there. And then they threw over the intermediate middle a couple times to Pitts and London. That's about all they have. Cousins cannot drive the ball deep down the field, especially outside the numbers. He can't roll out or escape the pocket because he has little to no mobility and he can't really drive into his throws. So this really gives the opportunity for the Eagles to kind of shrink the field. Oh, we don't need to dedicate much resources deep outside the numbers. We can be aggressive in the flats like we were against the Packers. In the preview, I predicted the Packers would spam the flats and make our defensive backs tackle. Well, that didn't actually happen. The Eagles did a good job of taking away easy flat throws. I think that will continue this week because that's pretty much the bread and butter for what they were doing previously. How about for you?
Yeah, you touched on a number of points that I really wrote down in my notes. So just to touch on real quick, when I opened the podcast and talked about week 1 not overreacting to one sample size, you brought up a good point of how much they ran outside zone and how much they ran it to the left away from TJ Watt. Some people might take that and say, "Oh, this is what the Falcons are going to do all year." Or this is what they're going to do the next week. It might have just been a thing where they were doing it for this game to run away from TJ Watt. So we'll have to see. They did tend to run what looked like to me a lot of zone weak. Now, the reason for that being is that you end up wanting to cut it back. So even when they did run outside zone at TJ Watt, the goal really was for it to cut back to the backside. Now, outside of that, you touched on Kirk Cousins, and it's the elephant in the room, his mobility, really. And this is the reason why this Falcons offense really doesn't scare me. And a lot of it starts with Kirk Cousins. His Achilles tear creates a infrastructure issue with this offense because having Kirk Cousins at quarterback with the offense that they're built to run doesn't mesh. So what I mean by that is the Falcons offense is built to be an outside zone play action bootleg team. That's what they're good at. That's what their offensive linemen are built for. That's what their team is constructed to do under Arthur Smith. That's what a Zach Robinson offense partly is, coming off of that Sean McVay tree. But the problem with that is you have to be able to run the bootleg, and at least run the bootleg fake action with enough conviction that it holds the backside defensive end, at least just for a brief hesitation, so that you can run outside zone away, so you can get that numbers advantage you need to run outside zone. If you cannot get that, the backside defensive end is just going to ignore the quarterback running the bootleg out the other way and crash down on Kirk Cousins, or excuse me, crash down on the running back running outside zone. So it destroys that whole play. And the Falcons didn't run one play action play in their first week, which is crazy. It's the first time that happened in Kirk Cousins' career. Now, the issue with that is, you would say, solution to that is, okay, become a duo team where you're running downhill run plays. And then that way your play action and pass plays that you can build off of that isn't having Kirk Cousins run bootleg and rollout actions. You can run vertical play action pass concepts where your quarterback's dropping straight back. You can help him with pass protection by keeping in an extra tight end or an extra running back to block. And then you can run play action passes that way. But the problem is the Falcons' offense is built to be an outside zone team. So the one play where they ran duo, it did not work at all. So that's the problem with this offense. If you're going to have Kirk Cousins, you have to be a duo team, but they're not built to be a duo team as with their current setup at offensive line. So it's a structure issue. You add on to that, their offensive line, I would say, is solid but not exceptional. So you can get after them. And we saw that in week 1. Now, albeit against a good Steelers team, like you said, they were good last year. They're good this year. I thought their offensive game plan was questionable in week 1, but at the same time, I feel like Zach Robinson's hands are tied a little bit. And then you brought up last point, middle of the field passing. That's a lot what they try to do. Their pass game was 5th quickest in time to throw, 19th lowest average depth of throw, and 0 passes thrown 20-plus yards downfield. And of the intermediate passes that they threw, because Kirk Cousins threw a lot of intermediate passes, 5 of the 8 intermediate passes were between the numbers. Of the 3 outside the numbers, he was 1 for 3, including the interception that ended the game. He doesn't really have the arm strength to drive and put it outside the numbers right now, so he's throwing it quick underneath, and then he's trying to throw over the middle because those are shorter passes. If I was a defense, I would sit on routes. I would not be worried about them beating me over the top because they don't really have explosive weapons to begin with, and we'll get into that with their receivers and tight ends. And then I would run a bunch of cover 3 sight, cover 3 buzz. These are plays where you can allow your safety to be the middle hook defender, and that really helps take away crossing routes, dig routes, routes that are thrown over the middle of the field. I'd run cover 6 and cover 8 variations, and I'd run the tricks adjustments off of that. Again, that essentially puts your safety in like a robber alignment, an alignment where they can roam the middle of the field and take away the middle of the field. Force Kirk Cousins to have to throw it outside, sit on routes because he's not gonna throw it deep. And then he was inaccurate, and I think a lot of that stems from the Achilles issue. He ends up having to use his upper body to generate power on the throws, and then he was leaving a lot of passes inside or bad ball placement, and he had the second most turnover-worthy plays in week 1. So just my overall thoughts on the scheme. Do you have anything else to add on to that before we jump into some player breakdowns?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is it crossed my mind that could they roll out there with Penix? Because Cousins, he's so limited that you're borderline forfeiting, at least on the offensive side. I'm not saying that the Eagles are guaranteed victory, but they're so limited in what they can actually do based off what we saw week 1 that, I mean, Fangio's got to be licking his chops. So just to try to maybe let Cousins heal a little bit and surprise the Eagles with a wild card, you trot Penix out there. If I were the Falcons, maybe I'd try that because with Cousins, I think their chances are slim to none.
Yeah. And, if they're going to do that, honestly, I think they have to put Cousins on injured reserve and say, hey, we need to give this guy a couple more weeks. Because if you just outright bench Cousins, you're going to have a quarterback controversy. at that point in time. So that's one of those you gotta. I'm sure the Falcons had conversations about this leading into the season, so we'll see what their plan was, going into that.
But they didn't tell Cousins, and he was upset about it. And the funny thing is, you mentioned how they got all these free agents older, which indicates they're all in. Then they turn around and draft a quarterback 8th overall when they're like desperate for line play. They could definitely use like a corner. Quinyon Mitchell might be on the Falcons right now if they didn't draft Penix. So then they're gonna just sit on that investment for a couple of years. Penix will only be able to play 2 years before they have to decide if they're gonna re-up him. And then by that time he'll already be like 27 years old because he's an old quarterback. What a bold gamble that was. That's why I would say, if I were them, just say, screw it. Let's roll Penix out there right now because Cousins is not what we thought he was.
You might as well. It might turn into one of these situations like you see end of career Matt Ryan situations where it's just like they are still like good quarterbacks, but their body just can't do the things that they need to be able to do to win at a high enough level to justify saying, hey, we're going to bring in this guy as a bridge quarterback. Now, moving on to player breakdowns. Quarterback, we pretty much touched on Kirk Cousins. You kind of had to with their situation. So I'm going to jump past that real quick, and then we'll jump to running back. So we touched on it briefly. You touched on Bijan Robinson. You really have to make sure that you're gang tackling this guy, that you're getting a lot of people to the ball, and make sure that you're good with your run fits when you are playing the Falcons and facing Bijan Robinson, because when you look at the 8th overall draft pick in the 2023 draft, his vision is his superpower, and add to that his cuts and his footwork and his acceleration and burst. So all of that combined together, you package that all together, and you add the size as well. That's an NFL workhorse running back right there. And he can do it all, really. He's gonna get the ball in all different kinds of ways. He's also a guy similar to Saquon that can attack you vertically downfield as a receiver. So you have to have your eyes on this guy at all time and be aware of where Bijan Robinson was at. I will say he does carry the ball loose, and he had 4 fumbles as a rookie. So get to the ball, second guy in, be working to strip that away. Now, I will add in Tyler Algier. He didn't get a ton of carries in this past game. I don't know if the split is always going to be like that. I imagine he's going to get some more carries, and he should. He's a good running back. He's a very solid running back, and he's a power back. He also has good vision. But as a 1-2 punch, this is one of the best 1-2 punches in the league with Algier and Robinson. When he comes onto the field, you have to be ready for him to bring the physicality and bring the attack. So you just have to be aware. When Bijan's on the field, you have to be alert for him in all sorts of ways. When Algier's on the field, just know you're going to get a physical back. So I'm kicking it over to you, Eric. What do you think of this running back room?
Yeah, I liked Bijan coming out, but I liked Gibbs more. Now they're both great. Bijan exceeded my expectations for sure. He's much more explosive than I thought he would be. And all the things you touched on, I agree with. Just also would throw in there, he has really good play strength. Specifically, arm tackles don't work against him, and he's got like the tree trunk legs and everything. He's gonna be a problem. I already mentioned before we hopped on the podcast that I had a premonition that he's gonna catch a 42-yard screen pass for a touchdown, specifically to the right. So I'm just calling my shot there. But I don't think the Falcons offense will be a well-oiled machine. They're going to have to lean on him heavily. And so I think, you're going to see him working the outside a lot. So I saw a few runs where people think they have the angle on him, but he's got just really good turn of foot and acceleration. And so even if you feel like you're like tracking his outside hip, he can just change the calculus on you, and then you end up having really bad leverage when you go to tackle him. and he can get an extra 3-4 yards right along the sideline. He's doing that kind of stuff consistently, especially because those tackles are generally against like defensive backs, or at the rare occasion, a linebacker who's worked this way all the way across the field, and that's just as difficult. So yeah, tackling to me is going to be at a premium, and really keying in on all these plays where he's going to be getting the ball in the flats, whether it's a swing pass, a screen pass. You mentioned other kind of gadget plays that can get him the ball. I would put tons of resources into trying to limit Bijan, because the chances that they're able to move the offense consistently the whole day without him is none. So I think Fangio will key on him, and then it'll just come down to execution. Can we actually wrangle him in the open field? And I think they'll also use him as eye candy too, because he'll draw a lot of eyes. But like you mentioned, there's not that much to worry about. It's not like Cousins is going to bomb it 50 yards over your head if you do get a little bit aggressive with some window dressing. So that's what I would say the Eagles should do, is like, banjo Bijan every play, which basically means if he goes one direction, you have one guy covering him. If he goes the other direction, you have another guy covering him. You're just distributing the coverage based off what side of the field he goes to. That way, you're never losing track of him. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the running back. And Algier's good too. He kind of impressed me. If he was on a different team that didn't have like a clear starter, he's that caliber of back to me. So yeah, you still have to be vigilant when he's out there as well.
Yeah, a lot of people are pissed at Arthur Smith last year for not giving Bijan more touches. But when you go and look at Algier on film, you can kind of understand why to a degree. You can understand why a coach would like a guy like Algier. Now, moving on to receiver, this passing offense really runs through three people. It's Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson. So we really have to focus on Drake London here. Drake London was a top 10 pick for the Falcons. He is a good contested catch wide receiver, has tremendous size, can really go up and sky and grab the ball above you. And I think that's something the Eagles will need to be concerned about, specifically when they get to the red zone, especially if Isaiah Rodgers is going to be back. That's a matchup that I have to feel they're going to try and target. So you're going to need to have some sort of plan in place. The Eagles do a number of things where they will try and double a receiver, but usually, especially in cover one, where they take that post safety, and since there's no deep post to take away, they will double a receiver. Usually it's like a slot receiver though. So if they put Drake London out wide to throw a fade, they're going to have to come up with a different plan for that. But getting back to London, he is a good route runner for his size, but I will say his burst and acceleration are a hindrance to him being a truly elite route runner and creating separation out of his breaks. He wins with body positioning and using his length, but that does give opponents opportunities to make plays on the ball. And again, he's not going to make a ton of plays taking the top off the defense. He really has to jump over you. So even if you get beat deep, you're going to have time to recover. So again, I would sit on routes. I'd sit on these curl routes. I'd sit on these out routes and these dig routes, especially knowing Cousins isn't going to be pushing the ball downfield. He's going to throw a lot of curls, a lot of digs. Sit on those kind of routes and wait for those. Looking at their other receivers, Darnell Mooney is a solid wide receiver 3, but he's operating as a wide receiver 2. He can hit some big plays, but I would say he's a bit inconsistent. He's not the biggest receiver either. He's shifty, gets in and out of his breaks pretty quickly, but not a ton of size to him. Has had some drop issues in the past. Ray McLeod is a receiver 3, has mainly been a gadget guy throughout his career, but he made some good plays in week 1, including going up and skying for a couple catches, even though he is an undersized receiver. But he's not someone that you're really worried about. He's not a burner. He's not going to take the top off the defense, and he's not a guy I would dedicate coverage to. Again, with Drake London, he's a good receiver, but he's not a great receiver. You don't need to rotate coverage to him. You don't need to make sure you have someone shadowing him at all times. Yes, certain situations like the red zone, make sure you have a plan in that situation, especially for some mismatches we might have. But I think more importantly is rotating the coverage into places where Kirk Cousins wants to throw to spots on the field. I think that's more important to take away than saying, hey, we need to eliminate this receiver completely. But what are your thoughts, Eric?
Yeah, I think Drake London's really good. Like you said, probably can't be elite because he doesn't have that long speed or burst. Um, like if you watched last year, he was getting zero separation on slants, but then he can just completely box out the defender. So if the ball placement's good, then you can't make a play on the ball. Very strong hands. I'll see him make catches in traffic, get a hit immediately, even away from his body, and hold on to it. I am concerned about the Rodgers matchup. Now, if you listen to our cornerback pod in the offseason, I talked about this. Isaiah Rodgers' arms are extremely long, and he can jump. So it mitigates that worry to some extent. But at the end of the day, it's not only his length, but also his weight. I don't know what London's weight is, but it's probably up close to 225, something in that range. Whereas Rodgers is around 180. So even if he's in position, he could get bullied there. One call I'm privy to is roll luggage, where they'll kind of play a zone coverage where they'll have a cornerback, in this case it could be Rodgers, sit underneath, and then you have a safety over the top. Kind of like what the way I like to think about it is in basketball, if you're fronting the post and then you have another guy behind him, like teams like to play Embiid, it's similar to that, but with football. I could see that being an effective counter. Like, but you mentioned it. Do you really have to dedicate that many resources to stopping him? It's maybe one of those things where it's like, okay, if he mosses Rodgers 2 or 3 times in a row, okay, now maybe you start to do it, but you don't need to panic and do that right off the first snap. And then, I mean, I almost include Pitts in their receiver room because he's a glorified receiver. It's not, he's rarely playing in line, and even when he does, he's not really blocking. So before I jump into Pitts, I want to hear what you think about him.
Yeah, so Pitts is an explosive player for the position. I mean, he's got great length and ability to attack the defense vertically. I think he has more straight line speed than quickness and agility. But listen, he is a mismatch. He is a weapon, so he's someone you have to be aware of. But again, with Kirk Cousins, it's like he's not going to be pushing the ball down the field to have a ton of jump ball opportunities or anything that really threatens you or scares you that much. And again, he has that jump ball factor to it, but he's not a guy that's like blazing speed that's going to burn you deep. You know, they don't really have that on this team. They're not going to take the top off with anyone. Can Darnell Mooney get behind you and beat you? Yes, he's an NFL player, but he's not someone that you're really that worried about. You know, so um, for that reason, Pitts is a good athlete for the position. I do think he is a good player, but like you mentioned it, they do try and find ways to make sure he isn't blocking. Their other tight end, Charlie Warner, is really more of their end line blocking tight end. You'll see him sift blocking across the formation a ton. He'll kind of sift across the formation and then be a lead blocker on outside zone plays. So something to watch. He does have a tell when he is going to be blocking, though. He really angles his body inside. But yeah, like you mentioned with Pitts, it's this passing offense is Drake London and Kyle Pitts, but I'm playing coverage to take away spots that Kirk Cousins wants to throw to. And the Eagles are gonna play, so roll luggage, like you mentioned, you're gonna be rotating your coverage to a specific defender or receiver based on how they're lined up. That coverage often ends up being cover 8. The Eagles are gonna run that as a big call that they're gonna run anyways. So it kind of goes hand in hand with, working to your advantage in both facets.
Yeah, and Pitts, the other thing is it's not like he's Jonnu Smith after the catch. Yeah, if he has a runway, it's like, okay, here comes a guy who's huge and fast. I don't want to tackle him. But he's not that quick to get up to speed with the ball, and he's not that shifty. So it really mitigates some of the worry in terms of like, oh, they're going to hit him on a tight end screen and he's going to run for 30 yards. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. He caught a touchdown last week where it was kind of just like a botch coverage and he found himself standing wide open in the corner of the end zone. Now, I do think the Falcons had a nice play design there. And ironically enough, it was one time that I can remember in all of their dropbacks where Cousins actually escaped the pocket and then he's rewarded with the touchdown. It was like, huh, I wonder if there's something to that. And maybe I've embellished it a little bit saying he can't move at all or he's a complete statue. It just, in terms of what he was to now, it's dramatic. And I think rather than he can't do it at all, he can't do it consistently. And therefore they took it out of their offense. Now, I did see some film that appeared to be from practice recently. Now, who knows? It could be out of date, but they were running under center play action. So maybe they try to run that more this week. I wouldn't go into the game thinking that's completely off the game plan until they prove that it's not. Like if they don't run it a single time in the first quarter, okay, then you probably don't have to worry about it. So I don't want to get too far off track, but it's just one of those things where you're glad that you're not that organization.
Now, jumping to offensive line, really, let's go through a brief overall view of the offensive line. It's an athletic but undersized unit. They're built to be an outside zone run scheme that operates off of play action, bootleg, and rollout game. Not really a downhill running physical attack, which is why I talked about that at the beginning of the show. So it kind of limits what they can do on offense. So when I talked about at the beginning of the show, not trying to extrapolate data and say this is going to be the team all throughout the year, they could come out next week and be a duo team. What the Rams were when Zach Robinson left. But just based on their personnel, I don't think they will be. I think they'll end up continuing to run a ton of outside zone. So having said that, they're a very experienced offensive line as well. They handle stunts well, but they had a tough week in week one. They were fourth in pressure rate allowed via PFF. They were fifth and fastest time to pressure via next gen stats. So when they did allow pressures, it was a fifth fastest time to pressure. So not only did they give up a lot of pressure, they gave it up quickly. Not a good combination to have. But looking at this offensive line, across the board, they're not overall exceptional as a unit. So we'll start with Jake Matthews at left tackle and who Josh Sweat is going to be going against. I think Jake Matthews is a good offensive tackle. He has good feet, posture, and strike timing, and I think he mirrors well with change of direction moves. He passes off and picks up stunts incredibly quickly, and he was 16th in pressure rate allowed among 87 qualifying offensive tackles in 2023. I'll be interested to see how Jake Matthews plays Josh Sweat. He's got a diverse skill set when it comes to hand strikes. So I'm interested to see how he tries to take away Sweat's moves. Sweat's got a vast array of pass rush moves as well. He's got counters on counters on counters, and he knows how to attack different offensive linemen. But Jake Matthews can kind of adapt his game as well. So I'm interested to see how this battle plays out. But Matthews is a good offensive lineman. I don't think he's a guy that Sweat's going to be dominating all game long. I wouldn't say this is probably going to be one of Sweat's better games. I think he'll still be able to make an impact somehow, but I don't think it's going to be pressure all game long. Left guard, Matthew Bergeron. I think he's about an average offensive guard. He started every game as a rookie in 2023. But I thought he was just average. But I think he's a starting caliber offensive line. He just needs to clean up some of his technique issues. He was 47th out of 85 qualifying offensive guards in pressure rate allowed in 2023. Drew Dahlman at center. I would try and figure out on third downs how to get Jalen Carter matched up on Dahlman. He was 35th out of 38 centers that qualified in pressure rate allowed in 2023. And against the Steelers, there were a couple of reps where his feet got extremely wide, and he shows both reasons why you don't want that to happen. First, he showed what happens when you get your feet extremely wide, too wide, and you need to change directions. You end up stepping underneath yourself, and then you let someone run right around you anyways. Then when your feet are too wide, you don't have a good power angle, good balance, and then you can just get pushed back easily. You can't absorb power and bull rushes. And just so overall, I think Jalen Carter is the guy that you have to get matched up, or Drew Dahlman's the guy that you got to get Jalen Carter matched up on third downs. And the reason why is when you look at Chris Lindstrom, I think this is a matchup to watch on the offensive line is Jalen Carter versus Chris Lindstrom. Chris Lindstrom is a two-time All-Pro over the past 2 years, so 2023, 2022 season. So he's at the height of his career. He allowed the fourth lowest pressure rates among guards in 2023, and he's an athletic player with really quick feet. This helps him in the run game win early and get to his spots off the line. He uses jump sets to win quickly as a pass protector, and he has a good ability to mirror and change direction well. Now, strength can overwhelm him, which is a reason why you see him jump set a lot. He's not a guy that's going to be absorbing contact too well. He can get tossed around a little bit. But the problem with that is jump setting Jalen Carter can be dangerous, and he is a guy that will win the strength matchup. So I would give the upper hand to Jalen Carter, but that's a matchup to watch. He did allow 3 pressures against the Steelers. He did get banged up during the game, but returned. His 3 pressures allowed would have been tied for his season high last year. But again, this is the reason why I'd get Carter and Dahlman in third down. Just go the easy route. Caleb McGary at right tackle. He's a solid player. He was 6th best in pressure rate allowed among offensive tackle in 2023. 3 players were under 20, were top 20 in pressure rate allowed amongst the offensive line last year. I think a lot of that had to do with their scheme, a lot of outside zone, bootleg, play action rollout game, somewhat similar to the Packers from last week, and we saw what happened with the Eagles. So McGary, low pressure rate allowed, but I do think he can get beat around the edge, and he is 6'7", so he's a guy that smaller players can kind of bend and rip under and dip around. That's interesting to watch going with Bryce Huff going against him. And there was they faced off last year. Huff didn't get any sacks. Again, we talked about their offense and how it is helpful to their offensive line, but there was a rep where he just absolutely destroyed McGary on a bull rush and flatlined him. So that's an interesting matchup to watch. But sorry for taking up a lot of time there, Eric. What's your thoughts on the offensive line?
I think Huff is going to have a bounce back game. Everyone was panicking about him in training camp. Then he came out and looked really good. Then we went on this terrible field, which completely neutralized what he's good at, which is having a really good get off and bending around the corner. And you watching the film, I don't know how many times he fell. I'd like to see a counter. It must have been at least a half dozen. And at 6'7" and a guy who got beat like a drum against TJ Watt, who I admit he's amongst the best edge rushers in the NFL, no doubt about it. But I think Huff could really make an impact, especially because Cousins is a statue. So when you know what your target is before the ball is snapped and you have the get off that Huff does and that huge leverage advantage between how low he plays versus McGary, I could see him wreaking havoc. Now, the Falcons will try to mitigate that probably by getting the ball out quickly. And so that's why we both hope that the Eagles play aggressively, sitting on routes and playing the flats aggressively. And if they do run a few more like long developing plays, I could see Huff really having a great game, and then the Eagles fans will be less concerned. Now, one last thing I'll touch on is I wonder what the snap counts will look like, because we actually saw Nolan Smith have more reps than Huff, which was pretty shocking. I don't foresee that continuing in the future. Now, I have one theory, not to get too sidetracked, which is if you look at how impactful a player is on a play-by-play basis, a situational pass rusher comes in and gets like an automatic pressure and sometimes turns it into a sack. If you're looking at it on the analytics side, it's like, let's just use him for that because we know he's going to be amazing for that, rather than cannibalizing his play across 60 snaps or however much if he was playing 3 downs. So I wouldn't all I'm saying is I wouldn't be shocked if the Eagles decide he's going to be a little bit towards the situational pass rusher side for the entire season.
Yeah, you make a good point there, and this is something I've been thinking about is BG what is a better run defender than Huff? So on early downs, he should be on the field over Huff. BG was also a better run defender than Reddick. Would Fangio have played BG on early downs over Reddick? I would be interested to think about that because he seems to want to play his best players on for their roles based on down and distance, based on situations, right? He seems like a guy that wants to utilize guys in certain ways. So it is interesting to think about. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a better usage of them. If BG is better against the run, then you should play him on early downs. And if Huff is better against the pass, he should play on passing downs. It really should be how it goes. And Huff isn't paid like a player that has to be an every down player. He's not paid to be a superstar player. He has a good contract, but is it top 20? I think it's top 20, but it's not like a top 10 contract at the position. It's not even close. It's almost half of what the top guys are getting. Interesting to think about. But before we move on to looking at the Falcons defense, I know we're running a little long here. Seems like that's probably going to be a trend every week. Anyway, I think they will run more stunts this week just based on the drop back pass nature of the Falcons offense, at least looking at last week. But ultimate thing, the Eagles defense has to get better at tackling. It has to get better at not giving up big plays against both the run and the pass. They have to be better at not blowing assignments. They have to be better in their run fits. I'm really looking for that and for that improvement for the offense, for the defense. I think we will see better, more sound defense this week, especially when compared to last week. First game of the season, new defense coordinator going against the Packers offense that was returning. Pretty much everyone was a starter returning. They're extremely diverse with their offense, with their use of motion and everything. The Falcons offense, they come from the Rams tree, who they probably use motion. They shift before they shift and before they motion. The Falcons offense didn't do that, but they're brand new. You wouldn't expect them in week one to be able to operate the way the Rams do. So for that reason, it was a little vanilla in week one. I think that'll help the Eagles with their coverage bust. Now, moving to the Falcons defense. It's an extremely experienced defense. Their youngest starter is 25 years old, and the rest of them are like 29, 30, 31, 32. They are an experienced defense at a number of key positions as well. They were a borderline top 10 defense in 2023, and they should be better with their upgrades in 2024, namely Justin Simmons and Matt Judon. But Eric, what are your thoughts on this Falcons defense? What'd you see on film and from the scheme?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned earlier, just because the team did something week one, that's not an indicator that that's who they are as a team, and that's what we should expect to see against the Eagles. That being said, the kind of the coverage shells that the Falcons were running, their blitz rate, how often they were disguising their coverage, how often they're running stunts, it was very similar to how the Eagles were in week one. The major difference being that when the Packers got in the high red zone, the Eagles were running cover zero repeatedly, whereas the Falcons were much more conservative in the red zone, obviously being like a low score, one score game the entire time. So I think it'll just be interesting juxtaposition between the Eagles and Falcons defense and how they kind of change between week one and week two, considering, how I mentioned all those rates were similar. I do expect the Falcons to be a little bit more worried about getting beat deep, because obviously the Eagles' passing offense and weapons is much more potent than the Packers. So that's why I just mentioned that we got to be vigilant about where Bates is the whole time, because this guy's range is ridiculous, very instinctive, and he's got good ball skills. I think in maybe last season he had 6 interceptions. So I think it's early in the season. It's one of these things where you don't want to make grand proclamations about what you expect unless it's like been a team that's had the same coordinator and players for several games now, multiple seasons, where it's like, okay, yeah, they'll throw in a few wrinkles, but we know what their MO is. I don't necessarily think we know that for the Falcons quite as much. Granted, you mentioned it, they do have a bunch of like older veteran players, so in that sense, maybe it is fair to predict that they're going to be similar in week 2. So before we get into the players, did you want to talk about the scheme?
Yeah, I thought the scheme was very similar to the Eagles, very similar to Vic Fangio's. And you have to remember, Raheem Morris was with Brandon Staley, who was with Vic Fangio, very close ties to Fangio. I think he was a linebacker coach for him with the Broncos before he became a coordinator. So you can see all of that passed down through Morris, and you see it play out in his defense. Now, there's things different, but there's a lot of things that are very similar. So, what's similar? They play a lot of too high coverages pre-snap and post-snap, but they'll rotate to cover 3. But a lot of too high coverages. They run a lot of cover 8 and cover 6 variations. They run a lot of cover 3, and their cover 3 that they run is very similar to Fangio's. A lot of cover 3 match. They'll run a lot of cover 3 buzz. They'll run creeper pressures with cover 3 behind it. But they run a lot of stuff. You touched on it, just especially with the safeties they have, very instinctual with Jesse Bates and Justin Simmons. They like to run coverages that allows those guys to be robbers. A lot of times in those coverages, especially cover 8, which is what the Eagles ran a lot last week and what Fangio likes to run and what the Falcons ran a lot in week 1. It allows the safety oftentimes becomes one of them becomes a free roamer and can just kind of patrol the middle of the field. You saw Justin Fields' passing chart last week. There was 0 passes in the middle of the field. There's a reason why. And I think it'll be somewhat similar for the Eagles this week in terms of they're not going to target a ton over the middle of the field. They will utilize different even fronts and odd fronts. That changes what runs are good. Different fronts are good against different types of runs. But the Falcons will utilize both, but they will shift to different fronts, kind of like the Eagles did last week, where they'd start in a even front and then shift to an odd front. The Falcons defense really looks to limit explosives. You touched on they generated very little pressure in week 1, but they also allowed the 26th worst completion percentage, but they allowed the 7th lowest average depth of target and 15th in yards per attempt. And they were also 4th best in yards after catch above expectation. So they weren't giving up a lot of big plays. They were giving up a lot of completions, but not a lot of big plays and not a lot of yards after the catch. They were kind of keeping everything in front and bottling everything up. And I think for that reason, we're going to see a lot of dinking and dunking from this offense. Their run defense was actually pretty solid in week 1, 3.3 yards per attempt, and their EPA per rush was 6th. Their yards per attempt was 4th in the NFL. I think this Eagles offense is going to attack in quick game, a lot of quick game with Devontae Smith in the slot, running option routes, hitch routes. I think they're going to run slants with him from the slot. They throw off the backside of the middle linebackers drop. So when cover 2 high coverages, so cover 6, you're going to see the middle linebacker slide to the side with the 3 receiving threats. So you'll see times when the running back just flies out of the backfield to the flat right away, and there will be 3 receiving threats to that side of the field. Well, that opens up a void in the middle of the field once the linebacker starts to chase. You'll see a lot of slant routes with Devontae Smith. Intermediate routes, I think you'll see some smash concepts to the cover 2 side when they run their cover 8 variation. And then deep shots, I think they'll run the Falcons offense doesn't give up a ton of explosive pass plays, but you can still try and take your shots. I think you'll see some double post plays, Mills concept, where that number 2 receiver runs a dig, outside receiver runs a post. You're really both of these options are trying to distract the safety and isolate the outside corner with an inside breaking deep route. I think we'll see them attack the backside post and trips, and then also running back wheel concepts, or even a tight end late wheel concept when the Falcons do end up dropping their edge rushers into coverage, because that does happen a lot. For the run game, I think running dart, which is essentially tackle power, where you pull the tackle against their odd fronts, is what we'll see a lot. And three, I think you really want to try and attack their safeties in the run game because their safeties rotate into the box, but they rotate from depth to distract and try and take away the middle of the field passing game. Try and run your run plays to so that they either cut back to the safety as the free hitter or run towards the safety as the free hitter. That's how I try and set up my run plays. But I do think there's a lot of really solid players across the board, which is why this defense doesn't give up a ton of big plays on the run in the run game or pass game. Blown coverages, bad run fits. It just doesn't happen a lot on this defense. Grady Jarrett is a good player and best interior pass rusher, and he used to be probably a top 10 player at the position in 2018 to 2022. But I don't think he's that same player still to this day. He'll move all over the interior of the defensive line, but he's not a guy that I think, especially after last week, I don't think he's a guy that I'm overly concerned about. He did tear his ACL in 2023, but he's recovered and played in week 1. David Onyemata is a solid run defender and a pass rusher, but again, he's nothing that's going to wow you. Just a solid player overall. Eric, any thoughts on the players that the Falcons have on their interior defensive line?
Oh, I think they're really soft in the middle. I think with the beef that the Eagles have, we're going to have success driving them off the line, getting a lot of vertical push. And this is where Saquon has his most success. When he can get through the line with some built-up speed, that he becomes a problem. That number one, he's going to finish falling forward. And while I think their linebackers are, pretty like instinctive and rangy, there's not going to have a fun time trying to tackle Saquon with a built-up speed. And yeah, in general, I think we're going to have a lot of success. And then they don't have enough explosiveness to really threaten us when we're passing. We mentioned Juergens and Becton. They have some concerns in pass protection. I don't necessarily think the Falcons have the personnel to exploit that. I think you're going to have the opportunity to have Juergens and Becton kind of double team Jarrett at times.
Moving on to edge rushers. This is a position for the Falcons it definitely was one of their weaknesses coming into the season, which is why you saw a lot of people mock edge rusher to them in the draft. They went out and addressed it by trading for Matthew Judon. He is probably a top 20 edge rusher. He had a 15.5 sack season in 2022, missed most of 2023 with his torn bicep. He's 32 years old, so there is some concern that he's not the same player he used to be. He'll move all over the line, though, and he is a good player. But stylistically, number one, Lane Johnson's going to be able to handle him if he goes to lane side. But stylistically, he is a good matchup for Jordan Mailata. He's not one of these shorter, shiftier guy that's built more with power, straight line speed. There are other edge players. Again, like I said, this is a position of need for them. They have Lorenzo Carter. I think he's a good run defender. I wouldn't say he is one of the best run defenders in the league, but I'd say he's a good run defender. But there's really no one outside of that that's providing consistent juice as a pass rusher. Do you see anyone else, Eric?
No, I don't think. I mean, Judon was really good, but I think he's probably just solid now. And definitely nothing you have to worry about going against Lane Johnson. It was talked about ad nauseum leading up to the draft that they needed edge rushers, and they didn't address that need. So I think overall it's not a good group.
Yeah, and that's why their time to their pressure rates were pretty low against the Steelers. Now, moving on to linebackers, Caden Ellis. He's a versatile linebacker similar to Bond, and you would see the Falcons shift pre-snap from an even fronts to odd fronts, similar to what the Eagles did in week 1 with Bond. So it kind of disguises the intentions of the defense. He's an every down player, though. He can play on the edge. He can play the run. He can play the pass. He's their only linebacker that plays every down. There are other linebackers, Nate Landman and Troy Anderson. Landman is their best run defender, and he comes in more on early downs. I would attack him in the pass game. I would use heavy personnel to 12 personnel to get him on the field, and then I would go to empty formations or twins wide receiver sets. That's going to force a linebacker into coverage or potentially having to guard a receiver in space and then run option routes with Devontae Smith against Landman. That'd be the way I'd attack him. Troy Anderson, he is not as good against the run, but he is better sideline to sideline. He's a more athletic player. He's better in space and in coverage. But I would, in 11 personnel, I would try and run downhill at him. I would run a bunch of duo this game. Like you mentioned, soft interior defensive line, get in 11 personnel, run at the soft linebacker, run downhill at these guys. Moving on to the corners, AJ Terrell is definitely their top corner. So last week I talked about how I wouldn't be scared going at Jair. I wouldn't be scared about going at AJ either. I think he is a good corner, but there's not any. There's maybe 5 corners that I would say stay away from with AJ Brown. So, and he's most likely gonna shadow him. He's shadowed Pickens for much of the game. So you're gonna have to target him, and I would try and isolate him, especially on get him into trip situations. He will be one-on-one. I would throw deep fades against with AJ against Terrell. Pickens beat him a couple times in week 1. That's a route that AJ should be able to beat him on. Mike Hughes is a solid and underrated corner. I don't know if they're going to be able to match AJ up on him. I think you can match Devontae up on him, but he's not the guy I'm really targeting anyways. And if you are targeting these corners, it's probably going to end up being a lot of curl routes. They're going to try and stay on top of you if you are not targeting, like if you do not put them on the backside of trips where they will press up on you and get no safety help and play one-on-one. D. Alford, he's probably their worst corner of the group, but again, he's not isolated much due to their coverage structure. So it's going to be hard to match these guys up one-on-one. The Falcons ran 1 rep of man coverage on Sunday against the Steelers. So in terms of one-on-ones, if you want to get a corner matched up one-on-one, it's going to have to be backside of trips. And the only way to do that is to have them play outside. So I don't think you're going to get D. Alford specifically matched up where he can't use leverage to his advantage in some way, shape, or form. What did you think about this cornerback group, Eric?
Yeah, I'm probably a little higher on Terrell than you. I think at this point, he's better than Jair Alexander because he's got a little bit of youth on him, more mobile. He can mirror a little bit better. Now, here's the thing. I think you're onto something when you say you can still throw at him because in the last 2 years, he has 0 interceptions. So it's like, yeah, maybe he can stay in a guy's hip pocket. He'll deflect away a few balls, but he's not really going to make you pay. Now, I think his second season, he did have 3 interceptions, so he's capable of it, but it's not something where you're like, oh my God, it's Duron Bland. He's going to get a pick 6 if we make a bad throw. But I also think it's like, why do that? When, like you mentioned, Hughes, I think, I just think about the delta between AJ and Terrell. It's moderate. But then you look at Smith versus Hughes, I think that's a bigger gap there. Now, they did run Devontae in the slot a ton. So maybe he goes up against Alford more. And he had a rough week 1. I think, from what I heard from Falcons fans, they actually were pretty optimistic about him after his first 2 seasons. But he's definitely a smaller guy. And even though Smith is smaller, we saw it in game 1. If he catches it in stride, he'll break those arm tackles. He's wiry up top, and that could give Alford some problems. I don't think Dotson is going to have a big game because I think Alford is a good matchup, or Hughes. They're both good matchups against him. So, yeah, overall, I think it's a solid group. But specifically, I would note that I don't think if we do throw interceptions, I don't think it's going to be coming from the corners.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think if it comes from anywhere, it's probably the safety group. But before I move on real quick, I'd say I agree with you with Terrell. I think he is better than Jair at this point in their careers. Just such the young man's position, and AJ is just a younger guy right now. And also, he does give up a lot of he gives up more catches and yards than you think. His yards per covered target, I think is top 40 last year, I believe. So not horrible, but he's not a guy that you have to avoid. and that you can't win against. Now, moving on to these safeties, I kind of grouped them together and how I wanted to talk about them. I will say Jesse Bates is definitely the more athletic player. You talked about him at the top of the podcast. I personally think I would say he's the best safety in the NFL. I know a lot of people give it to Antoine Winfield. I think it's Jesse Bates. But Justin Simmons as well. Both safeties are very smart, instinctive playmakers that will make you pay if you are not on your P's and Q's. And Jesse Bates in particular will take it to the house on you. They're also good in pursuit and fitting in the run. So they're a big reason why. And Jesse Bates was a huge reason why last year the Falcons defense took the jump it took. You add in Justin Simmons, that is a formidable duo roaming the middle of the field. It's going to scare teams off from throwing over the middle of the field this year. You're going to see a lot of splits where a lot of these outside receivers are going to be targeted a little bit more than you think, or they're going to be trying to target ways to get throws in the flat or to nail the safeties down based on the coverage and isolate a corner somehow. But Eric, what's your thoughts on these safeties overall?
Jesse Bates is amazing. Um, I wish I had been more familiar with his game over the past few seasons. Like starting off with the Bengals and then a sorry Falcons team. It's not like you're watching a ton of that film, but just in week one alone, by far the best player out there for the Falcons defense. And he's one of the few safeties where, yeah, he'll make plays as a post safety deep. In fact, he's had 3 interceptions or more in every single season of his career except for one. But he'll also make tackles for loss. So he'll rotate down and then blow up a run for -4 yards. And he's all over the field, highly instinctive, really good form tackler, great ball skills. So, I mean, yeah, I'd be hard to argue against him as the one of the top 1 or 2 safeties in the NFL. He's amazing. Simmons, I think we both kind of came to the conclusion that we weren't that upset that we didn't get him, specifically because he's not the player that he used to be. And when you're a guy where even in your peak you were like a 4.5, 4.6 guy, and you're using IQ, film study, and his length really to make an impact on the field, well, that each week that goes by, that's getting diminished. Now, he still looked pretty good out there. He made some nice plays in week one, so I think he's got gas left in the tank. But I would make a distinction between him and Bates in terms of you don't need to be so vigilant where every single snap you have to figure out, okay, where's Jesse Bates? But yeah, that, really good safety tandem. Without looking at all the depth charts in the NFL, they've got to be right up there at the top.
Yeah, and Justin Simmons will be interesting to see what happens with him this year. He GPS wise, if you look at the GPS numbers, he did take a big step back in his timed speeds last year. So we'll see how he transitions in this phase of his career. Now, having said that, to wrap this all up, we did want to talk about some predictions. We wanted to do an offensive prop, a defensive prop, and a game prediction each. We ran a little long, so we're going to skip the props. But I think a good way to wrap this all up is with a game prediction. So with the game score. Eric, do you have a score for the game? What do you think? How do you think this is going to go?
Yes, my prediction is 23-13 Eagles. I think the Falcons, as we mentioned, because of the lack of mobility for Cousins, lack of ability to push it deep downfield, it's going to reduce the chances of coverage busts. And the Falcons offense is going to stall out in the red zone a couple times. Like I mentioned, I think Bijan will catch a screen touchdown, and that'll get him to 13. And I think the Eagles, they may throw a turnover to Bates, and they might blow up a few plays in the backfield. We saw how they struggled in long yardage situations. Sometimes you get overly amped for that first real home game, and they might have a couple miscues. And overall, the Falcons defense, while they don't have a potent pass rush, I think they're a pretty solid defense and play soundly. And so that might lead to several field goals from the Eagles.
Yeah.
How about for you?
Yeah. Agreed there with the lower scoring. The Falcons offense is probably going to have to dink and dunk down the field just based on Kirk Cousins' ability to push the ball down the field and the Falcons' weapons. And the offense is struggling anyways. A number of the things that we talked about already in the podcast. The Falcons defense, while their pass rush isn't great and they don't probably have any superstar players outside of their Jesse Bates at safety, um, they're not a team that gives up a bunch of explosive plays. They're not just going to let you run the ball down the field on them, chunk gain after chunk gain. So it's going to take time for both offenses. If they're going to score touchdowns, it's going to take time to move the ball down the field. It's going to drain the clock. It's going to be a fast game, a low play total. And then when you get to the red zone, the Falcons' red zone defense last year, before they got Justin Simmons, was a top 5 red zone defense. So when you get to the red zone, you're going to end up kicking a lot of field goals. Steelers kicked 5 field goals last week. So for that reason, I have the Eagles winning, and I'm not a big favorites guy. I'm typically an underdog better, but the Eagles are 6.5 point favorites. And even though they haven't beat a team by more than 6 points more than one time in the past 11 games, I think the Eagles are going to get it done this time and cover the spread. I think they're going to win 23-16. I think it's going to be a touchdown and 3 field goals for the Falcons. I think the Eagles 2 touchdowns. I think they sputter out a few times as well, just not able to punch it in the end zone, and they end up kicking 3 field goals themselves. So having said that, I think the game goes under the 47-point total. We both think this is going to be a lower scoring game, so we'll see how this one turns out. But Eric, do you have any other closing thoughts before we get out of here?
Just a peek behind the curtains. We both discussed our prediction before the podcast, and I was shocked to hear we had almost the identical score. So it'll be fun to see how that shakes out.
Yep, it'll be fun to watch. But remember to like, subscribe, and spread the word. And until next time, go Birds.